Okay, I expect we're going to have people entering the webinar for a little while longer, but I'd like to welcome those of you who are here and hopefully welcoming some of you back because you've arrived at the latest installment of our ongoing series, our lecture series, East Central Vanguard, New Perspectives on the Avant-garde. And we're a few installments in already, and it's been really, in my humble opinion, a great series so far. I've really enjoyed all the conversations, and that's coming from me as someone who was maybe suspicious that the avant-garde had been overworked. But the beautiful thing about this series is it's bringing forward topics in the interwar avant-garde that have been neglected so far. And that's what's been really rewarding about it. And I think today's talk is going to continue very much in that vein. And so before we get to today's speaker, I just want to invite you preemptively to join us in 1 week. We're going to be back at the same time on Tuesday, April 6th, with the next lecture in this series. It's called The Zenithist Woman. And that will be, the presenter is Žarka Svirče from the Institute for Literature and Arts in Belgrade. And so please come back at this time in 1 week to join us for the next installment. And so at this point, by the way, I haven't introduced myself. I'm Chris Harwood, and I'm co-director of the East Central European Center here at the Harriman Institute at Columbia. And I am joined by my fellow co-director, Alexander Bošković, and he will take over and introduce today's speaker.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you so much for such a nice introduction and reminding our listeners of our series and what comes next. So it's my privilege today to introduce our today's speaker. His name is Gábor Dobó. He has a PhD in literary history, and he works as a literary historian at the Kassák Museum in Budapest, at Petőfi Literary Museum. He studied at the universities in Hungary, Italy, and France, and he is employee of the Kassák Museum since 2015. And currently is working on a research project called Lajos Kassák's Avant-garde Journals from an interdisciplinary perspective from 1915 to 1928. He published widely essays, articles, published in edited volumes. Also is editing currently a volume on Central Eastern European avant-garde. He is also a person who is involved in the work of museums, and he has curated several exhibitions, organized also conferences on the topics of avant-garde, avant-garde journals and movements. And Gábor Dobó is also a committee member of the European Society for Periodical Research. He was awarded a Fulbright visiting scholarship to the Harriman Institute at the Columbia University, and due to the COVID situation we are all in, his fellowship has been postponed to the next year, so he will be here with us in New York in next year, right, the next April 2022. I'm very looking forward to his presentation today, which title is Radical Women, Jolán Simon and Other Female Artists in Hungarian Avant-garde Periodicals. So Gábor, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for joining the East Central Vanguard lecture series. Many thanks to the Harriman Institute for inviting me into this program. I'm especially grateful to Alexander Bošković for involving me in this really inspiring lecture series. And many thanks to my colleagues at the Kassák Museum for their professional support. And my special thanks go to Anna Maria Juhász, who helped me a lot in preparing this presentation that I'm going to share in this moment. In my presentation, I set out to examine the position of women artists in and around Hungarian avant-garde periodicals. More specifically, I will analyze the activity of one figure, Jolán Simon, more in depth, as her case can be considered to be typical of East Central European avant-garde women in many respects. You can see her photos at the bottom middle and at the bottom right of this slide. I selected further photos of other women connected to or represented in Hungarian avant-garde journals in order to stress that many of them participated in Hungarian modernisms. While Jolán Simon contributed to the production, the networking activity, and the organizational work of avant-garde journals for decades, her multifaceted work remained largely overlooked. In Hungarian scholarship, she is first and foremost acknowledged as an avant-garde performer. Furthermore, she is also known as the wife of the influential artist Lajos Kassák. He was the editor-in-chief of several avant-garde journals, among them the internationally embedded periodical Ma, meaning Today. You can see the covers of some of the journals which Kassák edited from the 1910s to the 1930s on top of this slide. Or, as I will argue, they edited or rather produced these magazines with Jolán Simon, who, while remaining largely invisible, had a pivotal role in their realization. The phenomenon of the artist couple was quite prevalent in modernist and avant-garde movements. These couples often developed a sort of collaborative creativity, produced collective artworks, formed interpretative communities. Many times they were also so-called modern couples who propagated a new kind of lifestyle, including fashion, sexuality, politics, and biopolitics. They performed and incarnated the new man and woman. Similarly, Kassák and Jolán Simon constructed their public image together also as an avant-garde couple. On these portraits, you can track the evolution of their representations from a fin de siècle aesthetic to the constructivist one. While current international scholarship on modernism argues that artist couples were a constitutive element of avant-garde movements, scholars also problematize several aspects of these relationships, ranging from unequal power relations to the self-canonizing and self-historicizing ambitions of male members of these couples that often overshadowed women artists. In the following, I will argue that the avant-garde couple formed by Kassák and Jolán Simon mirrored similar dynamics. At this point, I would like to share with you how I personally ended up researching women in avant-garde journals. Besides helping to clarify my own position in this field, I think my path is also telling on a methodological level. I've been studying the historical avant-garde periodicals of East Central Europe, and more specifically that of Hungary, for several years now. Here you can see some interior photos of exhibitions that I co-curated about this subject. I was, and I am, especially interested in the editorial strategies, networking activities, and socio-cultural and financial embeddedness of these magazines. As most aspects of these problems are not directly visible or even hidden in the journals themselves, I have been relying to a large extent on editorial material and other archival documents in order to grasp the complexity of the production of these periodicals. For this research, I found Aleida Assmann's essay, Canon and the Archive, particularly inspiring. According to Assmann, archives are able to preserve what is non-canonical or even marginal, invisible to the mainstream understanding of culture at a given moment. This potential of memory institutions proved to be particularly relevant to me when it came to avant-garde women. During the archival research about Hungarian avant-garde magazines, I encountered the traces of numerous background figures who played important roles in the production of the magazines, chief edited by Lajos Kassák. But what made me completely reconsider my knowledge about the editorial background of these avant-garde journals were documents related to Kassák's partner, Jolán Simon. Indeed, it turned out from the correspondence that she carried out an essential work in these magazines that exceeded traditional journal editing. This activity remained mainly invisible for contemporary actors and for historians. In this regard, I have two basic research questions. The first is a historical one. What kind of activities were pursued exactly by avant-garde women related to avant-garde periodicals? And the second one is a historiographical or methodological question. How can we learn about more their widely invisible activity? And why do we know so little about their activities? In the following, I will present a case study about Jolán Simon, highlighting at the same time that her story is typical in many ways, and the problems that she encountered as an avant-garde woman were most of the time structural ones. For this purpose, I will bring some parallel cases from international avant-garde movements. On this slide, you can see East Central European avant-garde women who, similarly to Jolán Simon, pursued various activities in and around avant-garde magazines. Almost all of these figures have been covered in the current East Central Vanguard lecture series, by the way. My first hypothesis is that in order to deal with non-canonical figures, such as the majority of female artists, we also have to deal with non-canonical territories of artistic and knowledge production in which these women were often involved. This consideration is related to the fact that many cultural practices that were constitutive elements of modernisms of the interwar period remained to some extent peripheral in the later historical narratives about the so-called universal modernism. One of the central observations of the emerging field of periodical studies is illuminating from this respect, according to which periodicals have to conceptualize at complex ecosystems. Thus, researching modernist journals must involve not only the examination of the printed material itself, but have to consider the off-the-page activities of avant-garde editors as well, as Alexandra Kyriak rightly put in the first presentation of this series. Literary historian Anne L. Ardis, for example, argues that from around 1880, print culture as a revolutionary media technique and emerging modernisms during the same period were mutually interdependent tendencies. Therefore, the two environments must be analyzed together. Undoubtedly, this poses challenges to scholars dealing with modernism studies, as most of these off-the-page activities around magazines, similarly to and partly overlapping with the cultural practices that many women cultivated, are not falling into the traditional categories of literary and art history. The interpretative framework, calibrated primarily to investigate the canonical genres of high modernism, is insufficient to grasp the multifaceted nature of modernisms, plural, which both affects the research of periodicals and women artists. To illustrate the intersecting question of print culture, modernisms, and archives through the Hungarian case, I will analyze the three territories that were central to avant-garde movements, had an important role in modernist print culture, and involved many women, but have been traditionally uneasy to process in history writing. Firstly, on the left, you can see Russian dancer Murat Ziperovich posing in front of a manifesto of the Ma journal at the Ma soiree in the mid-1920s in Vienna. This newspaper clipping represents the methodological problem of investigating the events behind periodicals. Notably, soirees were meetings between the contributors of magazines and the public, aiming to create a direct, real-time dialogue between them and hosting ephemeral, performative events, which is very difficult to reconstruct and analyze in the framework of literary or art history. Secondly, on the right, you can see a photograph representing the contributors of the Ma magazine in the early 1920s in Viennese emigration. There is Kassák in the middle with his characteristic black Russian anarchist shirt, with Jolán Simon on his right and his sister, the poet Erzsi Újvári, on his left. This photo points to the methodological problem of analyzing groups and their dynamics behind journals. It also represents the question of a sort of collective authorship in periodicals, rather than isolated artworks authored by outstanding individuals. Finally, on this slide, you can see German dancer Palubka represented in various Hungarian avant-garde journals on several occasions. These photo reproductions are related to the question of how performative arts were represented in avant-garde periodicals. More precisely, how did the various media techniques, the different levels of representations and interpretations of them intersect in the avant-garde journals. In this case, the methodological challenge stands in the complex analysis of simultaneous presence of modernist photography, avant-garde performative arts and art theory writing in modernist magazines. It is already notable from these examples, and this is my preliminary conclusion at this point, that women played an important role in these in-between lesser-known fields of modernist print culture, and this is not a coincidence. In the following, I'm going to investigate the above-mentioned three territories and the related methodological challenges through the activities of Jolán Simon. Jolán Simon is first and foremost known as an avant-garde performer in Hungarian avant-garde studies. Coming from the lower classes and initially being a factory worker, Jolán Simon evidently didn't receive formal education as an actor. Together with his partner, Lajos Kassák, they gradually abandoned their original blue-collar milieu and entered the cultural sphere, even if their position in this field remained highly insecure for many years, and their living conditions were most of the time precarious. She completed an acting course in 1915, and from that point, she parallelly pursued various kinds of performing activities. Firstly, she started a conventional career as an actor, starring in minor roles in mainstream theaters in the 1910s. See the photo of the documents and the manifestos on the left and in the middle of this slide. While she often played the role of a servant or a maid in these pieces, these representations of the working class evidently remained in the framework of the bourgeois theater. Secondly, from the 1920s, she appeared in dozens of silent films as an extra, being part of the crowd in a given scene, for example, in major movie productions in Vienna. In this period, she spent some time in the Austrian capital, where his partner Kassák had to flee after the collapse of the 1919 Hungarian Republic of Councils. On the right of the slide, you can see her license issued by the Austrian Association of Film Actors. While Jolán Simon's ambition was to become an actor, she didn't succeed to take a step forward on the above-mentioned highly professionalized territories. All the while, from the mid-1910s on, she regularly performed avant-garde poems in soirees, obtaining more and more visibility. On this slide, you can see the flyers, the photos related to some of the soirees she participated in these decades, almost always in the context of avant-garde magazines. As an avant-garde performer connected to periodicals, she had growing importance as a mediator, operating somehow between the printed material and the public, which, for one reason or another, often had no direct access to the journals. The significance of her role as a mediating performer can be analyzed at least on two levels. This is more than evident when it comes to the soirees of the Ma journal, held outside of Hungary. In Vienna, for example, the public didn't necessarily understood Hungarian, reciting, however, Dada poems or verses in made-up pseudo-African languages in a captivating manner. She managed to reach the non-Hungarian public. Megan Forbes talked about this technique in detail last week. Thus, she fundamentally contributed to the transnational promotion of the Ma magazine, this Dada and later constructivism-oriented journal, published mostly in Hungarian language, even if in the 1920s, when it became an international hub in the network of avant-garde journals. Similarly, Jolán Simon played a mediator role between Kassák's avant-garde journals and the public of trade unions in Hungary. Hungarian avant-garde periodicals evidently had the ambition to revolutionize masses through revolutionary art. However, memoirs and reports published in left-wing journals testified that, not surprisingly, blue-collar workers simply couldn't access the experimental cultural codes of avant-garde poetry, art, and theory of art. All the while, Jolán Simon could reach this audience as well through her suggestive performances. Arguably, she was able to realize emancipatory cultural praxis and radical art at the same time, mediating between cutting-edge avant-garde journals and the working-class audience. As you can see in these pictures, during her performances, she wore somehow abstract constructivist dresses designed and produced by herself or by Kassák, by Kassák. Unfortunately, we don't have any recordings of her performances, but it is reported unanimously that she recited poems in a unique, alienating tone, a glass tone or a sort of falsetto. Thus, she was one of the many extraordinary performers creating a non-mimetic and transgressive staging of the female body and voice in international avant-garde movements. Last week, we could learn about Mira Holzbakova's performances from Megan Forbes. It is evident from these examples that it is not enough to investigate solely the periodicals if we want to learn about the imagined and real public of avant-garde journals and about the mediators, many of them women, who actually transmitted, interpreted them to their potential public, including the international and working class audience. My second point is that if we talk about women's role in avant-garde print culture, we have to consider their function as organizers and as catalysts as well. This is again, of course, a phenomenon that highlights both the central position of women in the communities behind periodicals on the one hand, and the challenges posed by these kinds of scarcely documented activities, conventionally considered non-artistic, to history writing on the other hand. In this regard, these group photos representing Jolán Simon and the Munka, meaning work, circle in the late 1920s are telling in many ways. First of all, you can see her in a literary central position. In these photos, I indicated her with the red circle. At the same time, it is also evident in these photos that the group itself was organized in a non-hierarchical way. It is safe to point out that Jolán Simon definitely doesn't have an authoritarian vibe on these photos. Surrounded by smiling children and workers, activists, artists, who most of the time were younger than her, at least by a decade or two. She was in her 40s by the end of the 1920s. Her role seems to be that of a coordinator rather than a head of a hypothetical Freudian tribe, as it was often the case of central male figures in avant-garde groups. These photos also reveal something about the nature of modernist print culture. As you can see, members of the circle demonstratively hold issues of the Munka periodical in these delightfully informal situations, such as hiking, having a bath in the Danube, a boat trip. Surprisingly enough, these apparently innocent leisure time activities were, in reality, highly political as well. On the one hand, they meant to be performing social practices of liberation of time and reframing leisure time in the context of workers' culture. On the other hand, while assembling in the nature, they tried to avoid the strict control of authorities imposed on left-wing groups in the interwar period. To sum up, the above-mentioned environments of workers' culture were evident milieus of avant-garde knowledge production and organizational work in which women had important roles. While Jolán Simon can be considered a central figure behind the journal, her name never appeared in the colophon of Kassák's periodicals, and during the 10 years run of Munka, she had only one publication in the journal. Consequently, most of these activities are not remembered in cultural memory due to their ephemeral, event-based, non-canonical nature as well. To provide a concrete example how Jolán Simon contributed to the cultural production behind modernist periodicals, the case of the so-called workers speaking choirs can be mentioned. This performative activity, closely related to the above-mentioned Munka journal, was led by Jolán Simon and can be considered the extension of the narrow communication channel provided by the journal. Speaking choirs were diffused predominantly in Central and East Central Europe in left-wing modernist and trade unionist milieus in the interwar period. You can see two of them on this slide. Besides the Munka choir, you can see the communist 100% choir on the right. Jolán Simon was involved in this scene from the beginning and led the Munka speaking choir from 1929. The heydays of this scene in Hungary were in the late 1920s and early 1930s, when a dozen of such ensembles were operating with a membership oscillating between a few dozen and 100 of participants each. They were staging collective performances, reciting both dramatized poems and literary works written directly to speaking choirs. According to Jolán Simon, who published a theoretical and methodological article about speaking choirs in the Munka magazine, and that is the only publication of her in this journal, speaking choirs should elaborate a new type of collective socialist culture as opposed to the present hegemony of individual bourgeois art. This meant a shift from her previous performative praxis toward collective performances. Speaking choirs were, most of the time, closely connected to periodicals. These group photos with people holding copies of their respective magazine demonstrate this strict connection. Choirs also performed so-called living journals, reciting summaries of current, mostly political news for the public. Thus, besides their artistic potential, choirs were able to directly and effectively communicate with their working class public. Speaking choirs, as the extension of a given journal, could involve people who simply didn't have enough free time to read journals, or had poor reading competencies, or couldn't afford subscribing for journals. To sum up, the avant-garde journal and speaking choir scene with their emancipatory practices and ambitions can be considered an exemplary case of what is called the creation of a subaltern counterpublic by Nancy Fraser. Fraser elaborated this framework to exceed Habermas' concept of the structure of the public sphere. According to Fraser, Habermas overgeneralized the bourgeois structure of the public sphere, thus having a blind spot where marginalized social groups are concerned, such as, for example, women and/or working class people. The relevance of Fraser's concept in our case is evident, especially when it comes to censorship. Notably, avant-garde journals and speaking choirs were formed in the context of state surveillance and control that determined them in many ways. Avoiding police control but remaining revolutionary, or at least political, was one of the main concerns of speaking choirs, so much so that it can be considered their structural feature. They had several techniques to resolve this paradoxical situation. On the left of this slide, for example, you can see the Munka speaking choir with Jolán Simon holding an issue of Munka in the middle. As you can see, their costume evoked both workers' clothes and created a sort of militant atmosphere without using any explicitly political symbol. They often held their performances in trade union halls. Both of these photos were taken on such an occasion. As holding public events also meant police control, with one or more police officers actually sitting in the audience and in charge to eventually stop the performance, speaking choirs often organized so-called open rehearsals, which were not subject to control of the authorities. Of course, performing their program during hikings in the Buddha Hills in the middle of nature also had the function of getting out from controlled spaces. You can see an example of this in this photo with Jolán Simon in the center. The third question that I want to discuss about Jolán Simon's role in Hungarian avant-garde print culture is her representation as a performer in periodicals. On this slide, you can see a photo sequence representing Jolán Simon created by the filmmaker, poet, and editor György Gerő, published in Kassák's journal Dokumentum in 1927. Gerő was the first avant-garde filmmaker in Hungary, and he wanted to avoid the mimetic, psychological language of theater, literature, photo, and painting, and minimizing, using his own term, the role of the actor. It is not surprising that Gerő invited Jolán Simon to act in this production. She, in line with Gerő's ideas, used a non-mimetic, alienating, abstract language in her performances, as we have already seen. Thus, this photo sequence could be considered an authentic self-representation of Jolán Simon as an avant-garde actor. However, this question is more complicated than that. Archival material that I found in the Kassák Museum reveal that Jolán Simon initially just didn't find Gerő's project inspiring, because, and I quote Jolán Simon, "My head and my hands would have been recorded in certain motions. After all, anyone could replace me for that 1 second role. In vain, I tried to convince Gerő that I'm replaceable in his film," end quote. The question arises, is this a dilemma of an avant-garde actor who experiments with a non-psychological, machine-like acting, but at the same time wants to develop her own unmistakable persona? If the earlier mentioned performative activities of Jolán Simon are scarcely documented and are on the fringes of canonical artistic genres, there is a territory of her activity which had been virtually unknown and is even more difficult to categorize. I would summarize it as a cognitive labor. Under this label, I intend to cover her informal yet indispensable contribution to the mock journal. Her role became especially important during the period between 1920s and 1926, when Lajos Kassák moved into political emigration from Budapest to Vienna, which was called Red Vienna because of its social democratic majority. During this period, Jolán Simon was, in contrast to Kassák, able to travel between the two capitals and arranged editorial meetings and negotiated with printing houses and distributors. From that correspondence, Jolán Simon emerges as a figure who develops into an independent, intellectual, and business person. In the first place, it can be reconstructed how she managed to prevail in these traditionally masculine locations and situations, for example, cafe houses, editorial rooms, printing houses. In this context, first, she had to claim a certain authority, in the epoch usually not attributed to women, and then she had to also put across the interest of the journal Ma. Moreover, Jolán Simon read, interpreted, and transmitted contemporary Hungarian journals, literature, literary, and cultural events to Kassák, who couldn't access them personally. She also interpreted and edited the texts that appeared in Ma, as well as Kassák's own literary and theoretical texts. In view of this, she can be considered a gatekeeper figure, to employ Pierre Bourdieu's term, in these years. For the last problem that I want to tackle, I borrowed the provocative question of an essay entitled "Who Paid for Modernism?" Originally, it is a paper of literary historian Paul Delaney, published in a volume focusing on new economic criticism. My point here is that while Jolán Simon was not the only one who paid for Hungarian modernism, memoirs and historical data unequivocally confirm that avant-garde journals edited by Kassák just couldn't have been realized without her support. She contributed essentially not only to the journal Ma, but also helped financing Kassák's life in Viennese emigration. In the meantime, additionally, she tried to support her 3 children and Kassák's mother in Budapest. Besides this unpaid informal reproductive labor in her family, she also carried out paid physical work such as dressmaking, pillow sheet making, and was a model for painters at the Academy of Fine Arts of Budapest in order to maintain her family and Hungarian avant-garde journals. Here you can see my little bit blurred photo of her iconic sewing machine, an unavoidable object in the history of Hungarian modernism, which turned up in a private collection recently. To conclude, I would like to stress that my research owes a lot to the rapidly growing field of women's studies dealing with avant-garde movements. In this regard, I found especially revealing the concept of the double margin, originally coined by Susan Rubin Sulaiman in her influential essay published in 1988. The term has been widely employed since then in more recent studies as well, like Ruth Hamus, Dada's Women, or in Györgyi Földes publications about Hungarian avant-garde. In their nuanced analysis, they claim that while avant-garde movements offered a strategy to subvert established social and artistic rules, and thus many women artists engaged in radical artistic experimentation in these circles, these same movements often reproduced the patriarchal dynamics of society and marginalized them. On top of that, while the art market, the later museology and history writing canonized many male avant-garde artists, the same areas and institutions were most of the time not eager to trace female artists who were often active in ephemeral, transgressive, and consequently less prestigious genres. Historical amnesia is even more evident concerning female artists and editors working in East and Central Europe due to the Iron Curtain and the dominance of Western institutions in knowledge production, which prevails until today. Most of them couldn't enter the so-called universal art history. However, merely broadening the canon is not the solution, in my opinion. Rather, a critical analysis of the power relations in the avant-garde groups and in their historization would be the right approach. Finally, I would like to emphasize that I've been presenting an ongoing work-in-progress research. Therefore, instead of presenting an elaborated and coherent narrative about Hungarian female contributors to avant-garde journals, I try to look into the problems that I have already encountered. So at this point, I clearly had more questions than answers. Consequently, I really count on your comments, insights, and further questions at the Q&A session. Thank you very much for your attention.
Well, thank you so much, Gábor, for this fascinating talk. I think it's a great way to continue from where we left off last time, and there's a lot of themes here that we're going to be able to interconnect. I want to encourage our audience to submit their own questions. If you're with us on the Zoom webinar, you can submit your questions through the Q&A tab. And if you're with us on YouTube, you can use the chat function, and those questions you submit to the chat will be forwarded to us. But maybe just to start things off, I was fascinated by the way you began to frame your question with this analysis, or this discussion anyway, of the artist couple model as something that was quite pervasive in different avant-gardes at the time. And I wonder if you consider that there is a primary archetype of that. Was there one power couple in the avant-garde that other subsequent couples were styling themselves after, or was it something that a model that emerged more or less spontaneously in multiple centers?
Well, it's a very good question. In Hungarian avant-garde, Kassák and Jolán Simon can be considered definitely to be a power couple. So a model for many other avant-garde couples, some of them coming from Kassák's or Jolán Simon's own family. So the daughter of Jolán Simon, dancer Etel Nagy, and István Vas, the poet, the avant-garde poet, were another couple, and there were many others. This is very, very complex field. I learned in recent years. There was an exhibition of modern couples, couple moderne, in Paris, and then in the UK about this subject, and they published an incredible anthology or catalog about modernist couples from all around the world, and it turned out that there were a huge variety of different kinds of couples, but the fact remains that it was a constitutive element of avant-garde, this lifestyle and at the same time artistic, collaborative, and sometimes very controversial relationships.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, if I can jump in also, I really enjoyed your presentation. This is for all of us, I guess, to learn a lot. But you also at the beginning began with like a larger kind of problem of framing your research, and you mentioned how the methodological issue is very very present, and what your research showed you so far, what are the best ways to kind of go into material culture to develop the story about performances that we don't have them in full record?
I don't know. It's very, very complex. I have my shortest answer is that I love using a kind of grounded theory. So to go to the archive, see directly the material which is available, which is many times is available in private collections, so are more or less hidden. And then to see parallel phenomena, to investigate them in a comparatistic way. As you have mentioned, the printed material is very, very important. So I mean, it's important. So distant reading is very, very useful, especially in terms of the Eastern European avant-garde with hundreds of publications, and now they are easily available on the internet. But we can learn a lot to go into the archive and see the exact copy that a certain artist owned, with all the notes and clippings and other traces that can tell a lot indeed of this mostly or partly untold story of Eastern European avant-gardes.
That's good. Another topic that you brought up that I was fascinated with was the actual connection that this group made with the workers' movement. I think the more familiar story is the kind of disconnect between the avant-garde elite and their theories and practices and the actual working class. But we see this here, and in particular in this institution of the speaking choir, which is fascinating. Do you know how far widespread the model of speaking choir was? Are you aware of instances of it in other centers of avant-garde?
Yeah, so again, this is an untold story, or it's an under-researched territory, but we do know that from the late 1920s until 1933, when the authorities banned all the speaking choirs in Hungary, there were a lot of them coming from different contexts, political contexts, and so party-related contexts and workers' movement contexts as well. And it became a quite widespread phenomenon by the early 1930s. We have some memoirs stating that as Jolán Simon's, so the speaking choir led by Jolán Simon made a tourney in Czechoslovakia, mainly the Hungarian speaking part of it. Speaking choirs were emerging after their performances, so they had a direct influence to communities, to workers forming speaking choirs.
Nice.
Yeah, I found very interesting the outfits that you mentioned that are both reminiscent of their kind of militant look and also workers' background. Are there any other activities that that the participants were involved in? Did you find maybe in your research something outside of the activities of the speaking choirs?
Yeah, so in this I rely on the work of other colleagues focusing on workers' culture in the Kassák Museum as well. So Judith Csatlós, my colleague, is one of these researchers. They found various activities besides speaking choirs, for example, photography, the social photography, as they called it. So photography practiced by workers about workers. So in a non-hierarchical way. So that was one of their activities. They were involved in sport activities. They organized also non-artistic, so other kind of non-artistic activities as well. So kind of self-teaching, self-forming activities, reading circles. And we are talking about blue-collar people, so really people working 6 days in factory and Sunday doing all these political / leisure time activities.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
We're starting to get some questions in from our online audience, so I'll forward the first one from Esther Balash. Could we say that Kassák transformed his conception of anti-art, that is bourgeois art, into an anti-culture movement, and that this is thanks to Jolán?
Hi, Esther. Thank you for your question. So anti-culture in a sense that, yes, if we mean it as deconstructing bourgeois art and reframing the function of art, which in Kassák's work and Jolán Simon's work was something which is, on the one hand, has an aesthetic potential and very reflected in a theoretical way, and on the other hand, it is political at the same time. So it's not only political and not only artistic, but something which is merging into avant-garde art. And it's, well, I don't want to judge whether it was as an experiment in a and the workers' culture's context was working or not, but that was the idea behind it.
Okay. Another question from Megan Forbes, our last presenter, who is very appreciative of your talk. And in particular, the comment you close with, cautioning us from simply expanding the canon to include women in the studies of Central and Eastern European avant-garde, but rather to start by critiquing the power relations that caused them to be excluded or made invisible after the fact. And she was very interested in the way that you highlighted Jolán Simon's role as a co-author, as something that's also been argued, I guess, in the case of Lucia Moholy, with regards to her collaborations with of course, Laszlo Moholy-Nagy. Your talk made me wonder also in relation to your comments about power couples, whether co-authorship can be instrumentalized as a kind of methodology for reinserting the role of women actors in the intellectual formation of avant-garde in both perhaps art historical or literary studies.
Hi, Megan. Thanks for this question. Well, at least I use this term co-authorship, or I like this term co-authorship in these cases. I think it's relevant. But what I also think that the terminology is not that important as the the framework that we use, or the mindset with which we approach these questions. So yes, co-authorship can be employed in my opinion, but again, in a critical way, meaning that we have to unveil or look into these power relations and see in which way they were co-authors.
Okay.
And yeah, if I can follow up, you also mentioned this role of Jolán Simon in as an organizer, as you call it, gatekeeper figure, right? Can you tell us more about which languages she worked with? Because as you mentioned, Kassák was not operating with other foreign languages.
Well, As far as we know, Jolán Simon neither. So she spoke Hungarian, only Hungarian, while performing poems, avant-garde poems. She used, again, Hungarian and made-up languages or African languages coming from anthologies edited by Dadaists. So, for example, Ivan Gogh's anthology. I couldn't detect these African languages or even the artwork, the poems which she recited, because many times the title is very generic. She also recited Kurt Schwitter's Dada poems, which are the language before the languages. Mm-hmm. So she was multilingual in this way.
Okay. And you didn't find any correspondence that she kept with some other international members, or there are some examples?
I didn't find. She was making correspondence with Kassák, basically, and with other family members involved in the avant-garde circles as well. Unfortunately, the international correspondence of Kassák and Jolán Simon are mostly lost. There are some traces in the Kassák Museum archives, and there are letters sent by Kassák to international avant-garde artists in archives of international figures, but not from Jolán Simon, but by Kassák, which were written by his colleagues who spoke multiple languages.
There are a few more questions that I'll ask Chris to read, but before we go there, why I'm asking these questions about language is because she's working as an actor in a silent film where, the speaking part is not the crucial one, and but at the same time she's also participating in soirees that are I assume mainly in Hungarian, right? And the way that we know about these performances has to be only through the material traces, mainly writings, right, and some of the photography or other materials recorded. So so I don't know. I think thinking about the role of language within the performance and unpacking or kind of developing the history of performance through these traces is an interesting question. And I'll leave it that as a comment, but
absolutely, yeah.
All right, so one thing that came in is, I think, more of a comment or a follow-up from Gábor's colleague at the Kassák Museum. This is Merce Szeredi, saying regarding Professor Boskovitz's question on the archival research and its limitations. I think it's important to stress that the Kassák Museum holds an extraordinary and complex set of archival materials regarding the untold story of Jolán Simon and other artists and members of the Hungarian avant-garde movement. For example, the whole personal correspondence of Kassák and Jolán Simon from 1909 on. And Gábor's processing and interpretive work with this archive is very important. As Kassák himself was already widely researched, but his fellow artists remain largely unknown. We also have a response from another presenter. It's Alexandra Kyriak saying, thank you, this is wonderful. I was really struck by her examination of the invisible labor, as was I, that Jolán Simon engaged in order to organize and finance avant-garde activities. I spoke of some Romanian women doing this too, and there are many other such figures. Sonia Delaunay financially supported Robert through her work. I wonder if we need to fundamentally change how we define what avant-gardes are and what they do in order to take account of these activities.
Thank you for the comments, Merce and Alexandra. Yes, my short answer is yes, we should change, I think, really our interpretation of how avant-garde worked, also because of this point of view or this subject.
And having especially in the mind that there is a whole reinvention of what artist is and what artist should be at that time, it is a good question to pose. What is this like gender shift, right? Does to that contribution to the image of new artist?
Yeah, exactly. And it's also a paradoxical thing because avant-garde movements, even futurism, which was really macho, but it was in many ways, it was an emancipatory project on many ways, while as a group, as some social structure, they reproduced many times the mainstream understanding of gender, for example.
Mm-hmm. Speaking of futurism, I was wondering when you introduced the category of artist couple, to what extent Mayakovsky and the Bricks was somewhere in the background for these people as an example of an untraditional couple.
Absolutely, they were included in my presentation originally. So there was a slide about them, but then I put off it because of, I don't know, copyright issues emerged in my mind. But absolutely, they were one of the iconic couples of international historical avant-gardes.
Mm-hmm. I'm also now like thinking about your presentation, that I like that Jolán Simon is appearing as a leader of the collective of the speaking choirs. And that's also an interesting point of looking at her and her activities in the late 20s. How did you find anything that she reflects on her role as someone who is participating in that capacity in speaking choirs, or are there any
Yeah, there are only 2 articles published by her, and both of them are about speaking choirs and how one should or can organize a speaking choir by her own, him own. And these theoretical texts are highly interesting, and in these texts we can detect somehow her own Ars Poetica, which was really it was based on collectivity. So she said that the leader of the speaking choir, she states it literally, that has to be a coordinator, basically. So somebody who organizes things, but the collectivity has to express an artistic and thus political message.
Mm-hmm. It does look like it has this performative value when you think about choreographer, or and it reminds me also like this notion of collective and its relation to an individual and the roles of individual within different collectives is something that in a Russian context has been like written a lot. And I wonder how much of that influence, because we're talking about this internalization of the worker as a figure, right? I'm wondering how much of that influence there is in Hungarian context at that time.
That's a very good question. I have to admit that I'm not an expert of Russian studies, but until the early 1930s, I'm pretty sure that there were no direct influences because from the Soviet Union, Hungarian avant-garde as like European, Western European figures didn't have direct information. So what they had was through the Russian emigration, living in Berlin, and from Berlin they could have information about how all these representations and technique work, and this kind of influences. So there is this kind of influence, but not coming from the Soviet Union directly.
Mm-hmm. And there are several members, if I remember, like Kameni and Moholy-Nagy, who did get I mean, they were even in Moscow, and they got in contact with Lisitsky in Europe, in Berlin.
Absolutely, but they were living in Berlin and elsewhere, but not in Hungary by then. So they were exceptions, but they were not working in Hungary anymore by this period.
And I also have one fetishistic question. Namely, I really like the book, the Book of New Artists that the Kassák published in Vienna. Is there any? Did you trace any influence of Simon on the work, his work on that book, or?
Well, so Jolán Simon was involved most of the times in organizing the design and the other organizational works in the printing materials. So going to the printing house to discuss the different typesets and so on. So she might have some contribution to that book as well. I'm not sure that she had for that particular book, but I do know that for other publications, important contributions of those years, she actively contributed to, as a mediator, more or less.
We've got another question in from the audience. This one is from Christian Trobe. Thanks for the interesting talk. What role does the success or failure that Kassák had in Vienna in connecting with artists there play in your evaluation of the role of Jolán Simon? The older thesis always assumes that Kassák's isolation in Vienna, while having established connections to other cities. What was the popularity of the soirees and the artists' evenings, and how can this be evaluated, considering that she was apparently more involved with this kind of dissemination?
It's a fundamental question, and I'm not sure I have a simple answer to that. These soirees had very limited audiences, but not that limited. So we know from reports that even 100 or 200 people participating in those soirees. It was, again, a paradoxical situation because there was Kassák in Viennese emigration editing the internationally important Ma journal with many, many international connections. But in Vienna itself they were isolated for cultural reasons, for linguistic reasons, because the Viennese art world just was not on this constructivist track by then. And in the meantime, Kassák and his colleagues just wanted to go back to Hungary to pursue their work. So some of them went to the Soviet Union or to Western important centers. But some of them were just eager to go back to Hungary and continue their work, and Kassák was definitely one of them. So he just didn't see himself in international circles.
I was curious about one thing you mentioned about Jolán Simon's performance. You said that there were some accounts of people who had witnessed the performance and characterized her delivery as this alienating tone, right? What I understand to be a sort of a non-naturalistic delivery of language. Do we know the genealogy of the dramatic theory that gave rise to that, or is it hard to pin down?
Wow, it's a very, very good point. I haven't researched that, and it's an important question also because it's this kind of, they called it this alienating tone. So the reporters or journalists called it glass tone. So it was a kind of like falsetto. But they repeatedly called it in this way, meaning that back then it meant something precisely. So it might have a history, or this might be a terminology indeed, as you said. Yeah. So I will. It's a very, very good point. I will look into that or in depth.
Great. And also the visuals that you use for advertising your own talk are from, and pardon my pronunciation, György Gero's film Documentum. Mm-hmm. And they are really fascinating. Is that film preserved in full form, and is it accessible somewhere where our audience could see it, if that's possible?
Well, we have only some images from that film, apart from which that I showed, published in the Documentum, and Gero himself published a script in another avant-garde journal in the mid-1920s, and some theoretical texts, and that's all. And Márton Orosz, art historian Márton Orosz, made an exhibition a few years ago at the National Gallery in Budapest about early Hungarian avant-garde film, and he did reconstruct, following this script, one of Gero's film, and widely researched this. But we don't have, so apart from this we don't have the movie itself as a movie. Only, again, the traces of the movie or the movies preserved most of the time in journals again. So this is again this very interesting multimedia function emerges of the.
And it reminds me a lot, as you said righteously, that Simon was complaining how this whole film minimalizes the role of the author itself, and it reminded me a lot of pantomima, the images themselves, and in Czechoslovakian context, that was a very, very important genre. I mean, throughout the Europe, obviously, I would assume that it had some influences on Hungarian avant-garde, there's been a great research done on alphabet book that also was initially a performance, right, with Milcha Majerova.
Originally a poem.
Originally a poem, exactly. But she had a whole choreography playing or performing that poem right on the stage. And this is an interesting, very interesting, back to my initial question, methodological issue or challenge, how to talk about this phenomena when we have a limited trace, limited source of record of the very artistic form.
Yeah, so the work that you have mentioned, the ABCD, right? So yeah. So it's a great parallel to this, but we have, as György Gero was also, has widely published art theory or film theory, early film theory. He made some references to abstract films. Viking Egeling was one of them, Hans Richter, László Moholy Nagy, and we can reconstruct in this way that these artists were the most important references of him. And he also states that he wanted to establish a new kind of visual language. So this is again, which has many international parallels in historical avant-garde movements in the 1920s.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because visually it looks like, free of gender binaries. And that's also something maybe interesting to direction to venture in research in terms of like gender and couples, avant-garde couples.
Another question on the since we're talking about gender that came in, which I'm going to guess that Gábor does not have the full answer for, but it's something that I think probably this whole group is going to be trying to answer going forward, and that is, have women in Hungarian avant-garde, for example, Jolán Simon, followed or observed other women artists from international avant-garde?
That's a fascinating question, really. For Jolán Simon, I just couldn't find any reference, but maybe colleagues can write their ideas in the chat. So I'm not saying that there were not such parallels or idols or models for her, but as far as I know, I couldn't find any. So that's my honest answer to this. Yeah.
Well, maybe that's a good note to start wrapping up on. Sort of one of many challenges, right? That this series has helped identify and lay out for us. And I hope there's going to be answers for us in the archives and the other places that you look.
Well, I have a partial answer to this, that on the other hand, Jolán Simon was a model for many women. So we know that from memoirs, for many memoirs and autobiographies of women, that she was indeed a model for them. And this, and again, this is the question of this lifestyle, avant-garde or modern lifestyle that was inspiring for many of them.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Gábor. This was really, I like that you brought our previous lectures in your own presentation, and it's nice to see that this series creates some sort of dialogue in between the lectures themselves. So I hope to continue this further on, and thank you everyone for joining us. And as Chris said, we'll see you next week.
Until then.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.